Okay. Hello, everyone. Good morning, and good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to Environmental Research 2023, the session about detection and attribution of climate change. So my name is Lixia Zhang from the Institute of Atmospheric Physics, Chinese Academy of Sciences. I would like to extend a warm and sincere welcome to each of you to join us today in this session. I'm deeply grateful for your participation. So in this session, we have invited 6 speakers to give 5 invited talks and a plenary talk to discuss the latest breakthroughs, exchange ideas, and collaboratively advance our understanding of this critical field. So the first speaker is Dr. Dáithí Stone. So I would like to briefly introduce Dr. Dáithí Stone. He is a climate scientist at NIWA, Aotearoa, New Zealand, with over 20 years of research and teaching experience in 7 countries. His research focuses on documenting how and why the climate has changed and is currently changing, as well as the influence these changes are having on natural, managed, and human systems. Much of his work centers on understanding changes in extreme weather and associated extreme weather risk. He will give us a plenary talk about monitoring dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. Let's welcome, please, Dr. Dáithí Stone.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Lixia, for inviting me to this, and thank you all for joining and listening in whichever time zone you happen to be in right now around this this world that we live in. This is going to be a very generic sort of talk, I guess, kind of high level. So not so much talking about specific research, but thinking about why we do detection and attribution, why it's actually important, and I think getting even more vital as we while the climate continues changing and as we work internationally towards dealing with climate change. Just to mention, there are a few people who I've named down below, but there are actually many people who have been involved in kind of setting up this journey that I've been on. This is kind of describing some of whom I've never met, just reading their papers and things like that. Okay, so starting back over 3 decades ago now, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, was agreed in Rio de Janeiro. And this is the international setup through which all negotiations on dealing with climate change occur. So it's still the main thing. So all these treaties, the Paris Agreement, and so on, all occur within the UNFCCC. Article 2 of the framework gets down to the real purpose of the thing. It states the goal, and it's quite succinct about it. It's to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. It's pretty straightforward. But thinking about it, how do we actually know? How do we know if we're actually avoiding, preventing dangerous interference with the climate system? So if there's one thing that we've learned in 70 years of environmental research, it's that we should monitor things, monitor. And it's only through monitoring really that we'll be able to determine whether we're succeeding or failing with respect to Article 2. Of course, there's an element, I'm a scientist, and as this cartoon kind of suggests down below, I'm probably never going to say that things are done and dusted. We don't need more research to do something. But I think in this case, it's actually true. So parsing this a bit more, how will we know? How might we actually monitor? achieving satisfaction of Article 2. Let's parse it a bit. So we'll start off with the anthropogenic in there. So we now have a global system for monitoring emissions. It's quite an involved, multifaceted system. And it's in place. It's monitoring things quite carefully, including, it goes actually through emissions to actual greenhouse gas concentrations as well. So, various aspects of the emissions chain. Okay, how about the end bit, about the climate system? We have several global products monitoring things like temperature variability and change, precipitation, less so for other climate measures, but they are around, particularly if you're willing to work with reanalyses. Okay, and then the final bit is kind of the dangerous interference with. That's a hard one to figure out. How do we monitor that? So I guess, what is dangerous interference? Article 2 of the UNFCCC, I have Article 2 there twice. It actually gives some suggestions. It gives some guidance. So the whole framework, or the work, what we want to do should be achieved within a time frame sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally to climate change. So it does assume that some climate change is happening and will occur, continue to occur. To ensure that food production is not threatened, and to enable economic development to proceed in a sustainable manner. Now, of course, these are all just giving some sort of guidance. There's a lot in there that's is much harder to figure out what that actually means in practice. But I guess for us, we can start with the idea that dangerous interference has to, at the very least, involve interference. So let's just work with that, and we'll worry about the dangerous later. So how might we monitor interference? So we could go, I guess I'll start on the second bullet point here, actually, with empirical evidence. We're observing long-term trends and measures of the climate system. We're measuring that in terms of some trends in other systems that are related to climate. But are all of these actually anthropogenic? We might just have the climate system fluctuates naturally from year to year, from decade to decade. Might these be just natural fluctuations, or might they be something that's just due to the eruption of a volcano that that caused a momentary blip in climate, and we're recovering after that? Okay, so I guess another way we could do is call it predictive evidence. Use process-based models, so our global climate models, to predict changes due to anthropogenic emissions. And of course, we use these quite extensively nowadays. We need them to predict how the future climate change will play out. But if we're using them, we're actually just monitoring our models. We have reasons to believe that these models mimic the real world, but they're not the real world itself, and they're not actually monitoring the real world. So they could be going off and doing their own thing, which is completely different from what's actually happening out there. So it wouldn't be monitoring. Ultimately, what we're dealing with here is causation. And so the question is, how can we monitor causation? This is the tricky bit. It's kind of an unusual thing to monitor. And this is where detection and attribution comes in. You'll hear me refer to it as DNA at times. So with detection and attribution, we confront our predictions with observations. So we make predictions of how past climate should have changed, given our knowledge of what's changes in greenhouse gas concentrations and our emissions, I guess, if you want to go further back. And we compare those against the observed changes. So do they agree? If so, this is evidence consistent with causation. If they don't agree, then it's evidence against it. And are other explanations plausible, or can we rule them out? If we can rule out any other plausible explanations we can think of, then that's evidence in favor of causation of greenhouse gases and human interference in the climate system. This process is known as detection and attribution, and there's a great example here from over 20 years ago from a paper by Peter Stott, in which so the black lines are the observations that just repeated 3 times. So this is observed global average temperature. And they ran a climate model, I think 4 times in each of 3 historical scenarios. So in the first one, they ran the model just with volcanic eruptions and changes in the solar brightness. And they started each of these 4 simulations off in a slightly different weather state. And so this, because of the climate is a chaotic system, this means it goes off and does its own thing. And you have 4 independent estimates of what could plausibly have happened through time. And the early part of the late part of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, the agreement was fairly good. But these natural simulations completely disagree on what should have happened past about 1960, 1970. Alternatively, you can take the second, the middle time series there, so labeled anthropogenic. In this case, they ran the model just with changes in greenhouse gas concentrations and aerosol forcings, aerosol burdens. I think this was before ozone and land use change were being incorporated. In this case, you kind of get a different sort of situation arising. So the models do match the observations over the past few decades, but there's a bit of disagreement kind of in the middle there around the 1940s, 1950s. In the punchline is when you get to the bottom plot, and you have all of these simulations in which all of the various drivers, the greenhouse gas concentrations, the aerosols, the volcanic eruptions, and the changes in the solar brightness are all being factored into the model. And in this case, actually, the match is well, if you change the black observations to a color in the model, you'd be hard pressed to actually distinguish which was which. So the message here is that neither natural forcings only nor anthropogenic forcings only can explain what's happened. You need all of those to explain what's going on. We can think of detection and attribution as an algorithm. So there are various steps to this, and each step you kind of helps bring, I guess, confidence, you can say, in your result. So the first question is your observations. How basically, what's the quality of the observations? Some diversity. How much are you understanding the uncertainties that might exist in the observations? Similar sort of situation in terms of the predictions that we make with the climate models. How good do we think the climate models are for what we're trying to look at, whether it's global mean temperature or precipitation in my backyard? And how diverse are the climate models as well, kind of spanning uncertainties that we might have in climate model construction. In this, then you get to so these are kind of the a priori criteria, and then you get to the actual comparison. This is often done, and actually I tend to do it with multiple linear regression. There could be other ways of doing it. So first, you kind of, with the anthropogenic signal, can we see the predicted signal in the observations? This accounts for the pattern and how, whether the magnitude is a decent match. Is that do we seem to be overestimating the anthropogenic signal or underestimating it? Is there that sort of a discrepancy? Then you question the alternatives, plausible alternatives. Could it be endogenous variability, just the year-to-year fluctuations in the climate system, decade to decade, that are just masquerading as some sort of long-term trend? Could it be due to natural forcings, the volcanoes going off? Could it be something we are missing? And you can do this, say, in the multiple linear regression case by looking at the residuals. Do the residuals have some sort of characteristics that look like, some sort of trend in the residuals, say, that make it look like there's something that we're missing? And then you could, I'll ignore this for the rest of the question. This is kind of where particularly it's often termed attribution, is the question of kind of importance. Is the anthropogenic signal actually a major one? I can call it a dominant one. So something about how large it is in relation to the alternatives. You might actually be able to detect an anthropogenic influence, but it's actually a really small effect. Okay, so let's look at confidence and detection. I'll do this for these regions around the world, all of which are about 500,000 square kilometers in size. And so here we've got a recent monitor of interference, as I'll refer to it. So these are, for each of these regions, we've done an assessment according to the that sort of algorithm that I showed there earlier. On 1961 to 2015, 5-yearly averages, and this is using the CMIP6 detection and attribution model intercomparison climate models. So it's about, I think, a dozen climate models with about probably about 70 simulations altogether, for both historical simulations and kind of natural historical simulations, in which case the anthropogenic emissions have been left out, and using observational products that covered the globe and were available around 2020, and covering at least the 1961 to 2015 period. There are a number of features you can see here. One thing is for temperature. There are some areas where there's very low confidence in and that we've detected a change. These generally are in the tropics, particularly in tropical Africa, and also around Antarctica. This is not, well, Antarctica might be a bit different. It actually hasn't been warming that much. But in terms of tropical Africa, this isn't really reflecting anything about whether climate change is occurring there. It's the fact that if you look at the observations, there isn't much from there. So the quality of the observations is really knocking this down. One of the advantages of using that sort of algorithm is that I've showed earlier is that you can actually go through and diagnose where your confidence is emerging and where it isn't. And in this case, what's really hammering it in that region is the sparsity of observations. Over in precipitation, it's a much more mixed sort of signal. If we were looking at whether it's a major factor, a large part of this area, you'd have very low or no confidence, because it's a much smaller amount. Whereas for the temperature one, if you were looking at whether it's a major contributor, actually the plot would look pretty similar. So we can look at how we've actually progressed in our predictions, what's contributed to changes in our monitoring over time. So this is the effect of looking at climate models from CMIP3, CMIP5, and CMIP6. So these are the climate models that were available in around 2006, which CMIP3, 2012, CMIP5, and about 2020, about now, for CMIP6. So if you look at temperature there, so each of these dots is one of the regions I was showing on the previous maps. The darker colors mean that you're further north in the world. And so what you basically, what we have plotted at the bottom there is CMIP5. So I think you're plotting against the confidence that you had based on the CMIP5 models. So if you look at the blue dots, these are the case where you have, you're using CMIP3, you're comparing against CMIP3. So all of the dots are below that diagonal, which means that the confidence was lower with the CMIP3 models. So basically the highest confidence you got was medium, whereas we're getting very high confidence with the CMIP5 models in many regions. A big factor here is that there were more models. Oh, I should mention that this comparison's been made from over the 1961 to 2000 period. So all of the models had data of, this is a fair comparison across the models. On the other hand, if we compare against CMIP6, so that would be the brown dots, if there was an increase in confidence, that would mean that we're going above the diagonal. And there's actually very little evidence that we've gone there. So for temperature, moving from the CMIP3 to the CMIP5 models made a big difference. CMIP5 to CMIP6, not so much. I haven't managed to get the precipitation data from the CMIP3 models, but I do have it from CMIP5 and CMIP6, and we see the same sort of thing, that actually there hasn't really been any progress. There wasn't any difference really in the confidence at the regional level between the CMIP5 and CMIP6 models. It's all lying more or less on the diagonal. One of the factors here actually is partly that there were more CMIP5 models that actually had the data. So there is a, according to the way this algorithm works, there's a increase in diversity across the models, or more diversity, which may or may not be true in actual fact. If you factor that in, there actually has been a slight general increase in confidence between them. We can do the same thing with looking at the observations from between those eras. There's actually very little change. Again, there's a slight tendency for an increase in confidence. Oh, sorry, this is observations. This is actually, this isn't the observational products. This is between the periods. So in the bottom plot, we have 1961 to 2000, and on the top, it's if you added an extra 15 years on the end. So you're going to 2015. So you've got a longer time series, and that should, you'd think, make things more detectable. In actual fact, it hasn't quite that much. It's done a slight job with of increasing confidence. With temperature, the dots do tend to be going more towards the above the diagonal. But with precipitation, actually, if anything, the dots are kind of a little below the diagonal. So we've almost had a decrease in confidence as we've gone on. So what's going on? One of the things we can look at with this sort of algorithm is what the factors that go into it. And there's a contribution in here according to the quality of the products is partly measured by the station density within the regions. And it ends up that the station density has gone down. So over the past it's partly because it takes a while, and often a decade, for stations to get incorporated, get their data updated into global products. It's also that we've actually shut down a large number of stations around the world since about 1990. And this means that actually we have less confidence in this deteriorates the quality of the observations when you give it a longer time frame. Excuse me. This effect is actually most pronounced in the tropics as well, at least with temperature. Okay, so just a couple of quick asides. Extreme weather. So we can use detection and attribution techniques on measures of moderate extremes. And of course, we care about them because they're the ones that actually cause a lot of the damages that we might see. Certainly, generally, they are. And in the context of climate change, we might surmise similarly. But this kind of extreme event attribution analysis, in which looks at individual extreme weather events and kind of diagnoses the effect of extreme weather, of climate change on that extreme event, can't really use detection and attribution techniques because you're just looking at a single event. You can use the components of it. You can look at trends and observations that might be relevant. You can use the climate models to your heart's content, but you're not really monitoring causation then. But we need to think of ways in which we can kind of merge this into detection and attribution and a monitoring system, because I think as scientists we feel the need to monitor, but that doesn't mean we should forget the unmonitored world. I mean, there's the kind of the joke of Nasreddin's ring. Nasreddin was a mystic in the 13th century, a Muslim mystic who had a number of fables, stories with him, and one involved his ring, which as nowadays is kind of told in terms of the lost wallet story, where a man's looking for his wallet under the streetlight because that's where he can see, even though he actually lost it, and he knows he lost it somewhere in the dark. Finally, dangerous interference. So dangerous is value-laden, but a prerequisite of that is that it would have to be impactful. So systematic monitoring is much more multifaceted when you start thinking about the effects of greenhouse gas emissions all the way through climate variables, right down to natural ecosystems and human systems, including cultural aspects. And it becomes you have many more causal factors involved. You have a problem that you have different metrics. How do you combine lives, dollars, cultural value, species extinctions? These are all things that are very different units and hard to synthesize. So monitoring synthesis has to be manual and laborious to some degree. So in summary, governments have set up global monitoring networks for emissions and climate change measures to support the goals of Article 2 of the UNFCCC, but they haven't done anything for the dangerous interference, really. The closest so far is in the assessment reports of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, but these are ad hoc. They're unfunded in terms of research. And they're not really standardized over time. So I've been arguing here that we need a formal global network to monitor causation and to monitor our progress towards satisfying Article 2. And I mean, the UNFCCC itself essentially says this, that it recognizes that the steps to require and understand and address climate change will be need to be based on relevant scientific, technical, and economic considerations, and continually reevaluated in the light of new findings in these areas. And I think that's calling out for monitoring. And I'm done. Thank you very much. I'll hand it back to the organizer now.
Yeah. So thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Dáithí Stone. So it's a very good talk about the monitoring of extreme dangerous extremes. So so I don't see the questions from the forum, but I do have several questions for your talk. The first question I'm wondering is, so you said we need to merge so the model prediction or simulation with the observation. It's kind of a monitoring. So how to merge them together?
How to merge
the model prediction and observation.
For extreme weather, or just generally?
Generally. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this is through by confronting them. So there has, of course, been talk of other ways of merging them as well, such as through reanalyses that you could actually look at as you're going with reanalyses. Look at what's kind of pulling. Supposedly, if you remove greenhouse gas increases in greenhouse gas concentrations in a reanalysis, you'll see that it's being pulled in a direction towards a warmer case by the assimilation. So that would be another way you could do it. But I think this way, where you compare the two of them and you require agreement. Basically, you're taking all of your sources of information and ensuring that they agree with each other. That's how you build confidence.
Yeah. So I have another question about so you say, yeah, as you said, this kind of monitoring is not only focused on the extreme event or climate system, but also on the ecosystems and also the other different aspects or the impact aspect. So how do you think to combine this kind of different types of the impact of extremes with this kind of monitoring?
So in terms of impacts, I mean, there's a lot of work done understanding the effects of climate trends on ecosystems in particular, but other parts of other natural and human systems, hydrology and glaciers, of course, the cryosphere. But that doesn't consider what's the cause of the climate trends. So I think the easiest way is to then kind of what's been known as two-step or multi-step attribution. That's often been called, where you kind of look at the relevant climate variable, the domain, the time period that's relevant for that impact, and you perform a climate detection and attribution analysis, and then you merge the two, you combine the two. That's what we'd actually done in that last map I showed there with Garrett Hansen. I mean, one of the problems, of course, when you get into impacts is a lot of that stuff isn't called detection and attribution. It might be called epidemiology. It might be called something else. And so trying to make those links is often quite challenging. But it is laborious because it's kind of has to be done one by one.
Yeah, thank you. So last question is, I say the confidence is lower in the observation, since So since with a longer period, right? So, but in my opinion, so I think there are many satellite observations also merged into the observations. So, is any benefit from the satellite observations?
So this is in the analysis. I should have called out a few caveats, perhaps in what I was showing there. One of the things is that I'm insisting that they're global land products. So or global products that include all of the land areas. So I'm ignoring, there might be a national product that's actually really good, better quality. There might be several. I haven't included reanalyses, which of course had some sort of information in there as well. And none of the products include precipitation. Essentially, or include, sorry, none of the products include satellite retrievals for precipitation, because I wanted to go back before 1980, and that introduces a bit of a discontinuity generally if you try to go back earlier than that with those sorts of where you're merging products or merging data sources like satellites and stations. So yeah, it may be as well. I've got to look into it a bit more, that I'm demanding. I might be demanding too high a station density, and because it does surprise me a little bit when I see that. But I think it's a thing to call out, because it's not a factor that you usually see considered in detection and attribution studies. Some sort of assessment of the quality of the observational products usually isn't there. There's been no research done. There's been quite a bit of research done to figure out how many climate models do we really have, because of course they're related to each other. But there hasn't been a similar thing done for how many observational products do we really have.
Yeah,
I think that's a big question.
Okay, so there are some questions in the live questions in the forum. So one question is, did I understand correctly that a number of climate monitoring stations have shut down since 1990s? So if so, why is this?
I'm not too sure exactly why it is, but it is something, since about there was a peak in station density from 1960 to 1990. Essentially, it was it comes down to cuts, and I think also a decision that probably there weren't so many stations required, particularly when it came to temperature, to continue monitoring the climate long term. I guess a lot of them that were there to support weather forecasting, and as weather other aspects, satellites got a lot better, or the weather forecast angle wasn't able to justify the cost of supporting them. Yeah, and around the same time, most of the stations, of course, switched from manual to automatic as well.
Okay. So the last question is, wouldn't it be more ideal to monitor a model with observations? How would you then handle the spatial temporal mismatch? So, say,
So, pardon,
wouldn't it be more ideal to monitor models with observations? So,
I see.
yeah.
Is this could be interpreted two ways. It could be in terms of a reanalysis, so understanding what your what the observations that you're assimilating in are doing to the model, which way they're tugging it. Or it could be in terms of, I think, something pretty similar to what I was saying, where you're continually comparing the two.
Okay.
Yeah, but there are various ways you can do it. But I think the key thing is to monitor causation. That's what we need to work on.
Okay, thank you. So because of time limit, thank you again. So we will go to the next talk. Thank you again, Dáithí.
Thank you.
Thank you. So the next speaker is Dr. Sarah Perkins-Kirkpatrick. She is an associate professor and the ARC Future Fellow in the School of Science, UNSW, Canberra. She is also a chief investigator with ARC Center of Excellence for Climate Streams, a deputy director of the upcoming ARC Center of Excellence for 21st Century Weather. She is the recipient of the 2021 Australian Academy of Science Dorothy Hill Medal. Sarah's experience focuses on heat waves and event attribution. She leads pioneering research on how to measure heat waves and their changes in the observational record. She is also interested in how natural climate variability drives heat waves, as well as employing detection attribution method to understanding how climate change influences specific event extremes and their impacts. So let's welcome Sarah to give her talk.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. Good evening. It's late at night here in Australia. So I do apologise if I'm a bit slow off the mark and with some of these details in this talk. So what I want to talk to you about today is how we can go about attributing the extreme events, attributing the impacts of extreme events, why it's different and why we need to separate it from their causal events. So this is based on two pieces of work that I've been researching over the last few years, one of which is already published in Environmental Research Letters, and another of which is an ongoing piece of work that's been in collaboration with some health experts. So Dáithí's given us a really nice presentation looking at some aspects of attribution overall. But what I'm going to talk about this evening is much more specific to extreme events and their associated impacts. So over the last 20 or so years, there's been a really significant increase in the popularity of event attribution. And by event attribution, I mean isolating the anthropogenic signal behind extreme events of interest. So this might be, for example, a heat wave, bushfires, or even tropical cyclones. And all these types of events have been attributed in one way or another to climate change in the academic literature. It is important to remember that when you do find a signal behind a specific extreme event, it's just that it's specific to that particular extreme or that particular study, and also the methods that underpin that type of study. So, for example, the attributable signal behind the European heatwave in 2003, for example, would be quite different to a heatwave that might occur over Australia within the coming summer. But basically, I wanted to get the point across here that attribution has become extremely popular, and specifically when we're looking at high impact extremes. So because of that, over the last few years, so really in the shape of the last 6 to 7 years, the field has started to move on towards impacts attribution. And as I mentioned earlier, this is where we try and isolate the anthropogenic influence behind the impact of certain extreme events. So it's not just the specific or extreme event in terms of like a heat wave or a tropical cyclone, for example. It's then moving on to the impacts that these might cause. So this may be financial damages caused by a cyclone, for example, the mortality or morbidity burdens caused by heat waves, insured losses caused by floods, any sort of impacts that you might consider that might be a function of a specific extreme event. Now, this is a very new field. It has only been around for the last 6 or 7 years. And because of that, there's not really any sort of clear methods on how we should approach that, approach this sort of analysis. So the studies I've listed here, they've kind of had a go at it, and they have had a good go at it because it's such a huge challenge, yet such an important one. We really, we were really trying our best to work out how to do this, but really not knowing where exactly to start. One thing that I will point out, however, that some of these early studies that tried to look at the attributing the impacts of extreme events to climate change use something called the fraction of attributable risk method. Now, this method, or the FAR method, has been very popular in looking at how climate extremes may be attributable to anthropogenic influence. But a very important point to make here is that FAR assessments are for a class of events. So by a class of event, I mean events that are at least as big as a given threshold. And this is true for whether you're looking at a climate extreme or the impacts that that extreme induces. You cannot say that, for example, if we get a FAR value of 0.7, that 70% of the impacts caused by a specific event is due to climate change. It's more saying that 70% of that impact, 70 impacts greater than that 70% of impacts greater than that threshold are related to climate change. So as you can see here, this is quite nuanced. It's quite specific. And I'm sure some of you are looking a bit bewildered as I have this slide up. And it did take myself and my colleagues quite a number of months to work out why FAR didn't actually apply when we're looking at the impacts of specific extreme events. But the main point to remember here, if you're stewing over this a bit later, is that FAR assessments are for a class of events, not a specific single event. Therefore, we cannot use FAR assessments to quantify the anthropogenic influence, either behind a specific climate event or the impacts that they may induce. So when we move on to impacts attribution, there's even more uncertainties than what we normally have when we're just looking at extreme event attribution, which I haven't really gone into in much detail here. But some of these uncertainties come down to how is the impact estimated and how does this impact relate to the climate data? We do have many tools available to us to do extreme event attribution, most of which rely on observations and also physical climate model data. But there's quite a large additional step of uncertainty when we're looking at impacts. There are many different ways to estimate a certain impact. For example, looking at mortality estimates, that can be done in quite a variety of ways, which would altogether then be different methods when we're looking at something like financial damages. So we really are opening up this envelope of uncertainty when we're going down to the impact-based level. On top of that, we are considering now how does the attribution of the climate event relate to the attribution of the impact. And some previous studies that are looking at impact attribution assumed that it'd be a one-for-one relationship. So whatever the anthropogenic signal was behind the causal extreme event would be the exact same for the resulting impact. And that's actually not the case, as I'll prove a bit later. So on top of this, as I've stated earlier, so deducting from this, the first main point here is the climate fraction of attributable risks does not always equate to the impact FAR. And once again, these are for the class of events. And secondly, as I've shown and it tried to explain on the previous slide, FAR assessments are for a class of events and cannot be applied to a single event, which is actually quite common, commonly believed outside of climate science. So in a study that I led and was published at the beginning of last year in Environmental Research Letters, we tried to reconcile this by introducing a nuanced slither approach. So this by no means is a sophisticated method, nor is it the only method that we can do impacts attribution in. However, it was a way to kind of reconcile why the fraction of attributable risk method cannot be used for a specific impacts attribution. However, this particular method also relies on the same samples of climate model data. So it doesn't mean that we need extra resources, at least from the climatological side in terms of the attribution assessment. It's just really how we approach the methodology. And once again, it's quite nuanced, but really not that mind-bending once you get down into the calculations. So the example I've used here is, say that we're interested in a mortality rate due to a heat wave. where roughly 34 deaths per 100,000 were recorded. So in this particular event, if we look at the red plume, in the factual world, this mortality rate was considered a 1 in 70-year event. So we expect a heat wave that kills roughly 34 people per 100,000 to occur once per 70 years. However, in the counterfactual world, which is what we get when we look at climate model simulations without climate change included, the return period, the death rate for an event with the same return period, which is 1 in 70 years, is 30 deaths per 100,000. So we can therefore say for this specific impact of a heat wave, we've seen an increase of 4 deaths per 100,000. So that's the attributable impact to climate change for this specific heat wave. Now, on top of that, the waiting time for a heat event where 34 people per 100,000 pass away has reduced by 130 years, as it was a 1 in 200-year event in the counterfactual world. So we can also say by how much the waiting time of this specific heat wave impact has changed. So it's not, the analysis here, once again, is not, particularly, it's certainly not rocket science, but it's separating out that sort of impact and moving away from looking at a class of events and focusing more on the specific event and how that's changed in the counterfactual and factual climate model simulations. So in this study, we illustrated our slither approach with 2 case studies or 2 examples, one of which was looking at a mortality rate during a heat wave in London in 2006. And another event was looking at rainfall over the North Island of New Zealand due to an ex-tropical cyclone that caused a lot of flooding and economic damage. So for both of these studies, we had previously defined transfer functions to estimate the impacts, which were derived by relative experts in these fields. So it certainly wasn't something that us climate scientists decided to do by ourselves. We actually collaborated with experts in the respective fields. Now, this figure is the first figure out of the paper. By no means do I expect anyone to understand or read or take all this in this talk. But I just wanted to show you the steps and quite a large number of steps we took in terms of getting the climate model data in the right format, estimating the impact, and attributing the impact of the specific event as well as the class of events to climate change. There are similar type of steps between the two case studies. However, you can see that the numbers of each step changes, and this is basically because each event was different and their impacts were different and needed just slightly different tweaks in the methodology. But you can see that there are 3 main parts to each of the assessments, and this is something that I would strongly suggest would apply to any sort of impacts attribution assessment. And they are quite involved. It's certainly not something that you can do within a week. This really took months and months of analysis to kind of get right. So looking at the first case study was looking at London heat and mortality. You can see here that for this particular event, 60 people died because of this particular heat wave. Now, we did compute the FAR analyses to kind of show that the FAR doesn't really apply in these sorts of events, and the fact that it's also different between the causal event and the actual impact. But in this case, the return period of an event with 60 deaths was 1 in 4 years. In the counterfactual, however, the deaths associated with the 1 in 4 year event was actually 50. So we saw a 17% increase in the deaths of this event due to climate change. There was also almost a doubling of this in frequency of this class of events. So that's events greater than a 60 person mortality rate. But you can see here, looking at the 2 figures, that especially the FAR assessment is different across the heat-related mortality figure on the left and the London temperature figure on the right. So by this, I mean that we simply cannot take the FAR that's taken from the London temperature analyses and fit it to the heat-related mortality analyses. Now, once again, I'll mention that the FAR assessment is not going to tell us anything about the specific impacts. of a particular event, but it can certainly tell us something about events at least as big as our threshold. And in this case, the FAR simply isn't transferable across the causal event and in this case, the mortality rate. So the second case study we looked at was New Zealand rainfall and the financial damages ensued by this. Now, I will state that the way that financial damages were estimated did come from real data. It came from insured data in New Zealand, but this was a public insurance data set. So it really only captured a fraction of the total insured losses of this particular event. So if these figures look quite small to you in terms of the payouts associated with this event, that's why. Now, for this particular event, you can see the return values are a lot different, and there is also some uncertainty in the counterfactual simulations when we're looking at really high return periods. However, this particular event was much lower in terms of its return values, but we still saw an increase in almost 500,000 New Zealand dollars due to climate change for this specific event because of how much the event has shifted in terms of its frequency between the counterfactual and factual climate model simulations. You'll notice there that there's a positive FAR value, so that means that events with at least as big as this specific financial damage had a detectable signal due to climate change. But this signal is quite a lot different to what we expected or what we computed from the rainfall that actually caused this event. Firstly, the FAR value for the causal event is quite uncertain. However, it is much more certain for the insured losses. So once again, this highlights that you simply cannot assume that the anthropogenic impact behind the causal event or a class of causal events is exactly the same for the class of the associated impact. Okay, so for the remainder of the presentation, I just wanted to talk about how we are now applying this method to an actual real-life event. In the study that I was just previously talked about, we use certain case studies to illustrate our point, but now we're actually applying it to an Australian heatwave. Now, I have done quite a lot of work on heatwaves, as was introduced before my talk, so I won't go into a whole lot of detail, but basically we had a very bad heat wave here about 14 years ago that lasted for over 2 weeks and had some exceedingly high temperatures associated with it. Now over Victoria, which is this part of Australia in the far southeast, up to 374 excess deaths were reported during this event. And this heat wave immediately preceded our Black Saturday bushfires, which killed almost 200 people in one day alone. So it was a very significant heat wave, a very significant setup of extreme events in many different ways. Now, I know that this death toll doesn't really compare to the sorts of death tolls that we see coming out of other countries due to heat waves, but given our relatively sparse population here in Australia, it was a very significant event for us. So when we wanted to attribute this particular, the amount of people who were killed during this particular heat wave, we of course had to work quite closely with health researchers and epidemiologists. And a lot of questions arose. It wasn't simply a case of mapping an impact to climate model data. We really had to understand the best way to do this. And this came with a lot of questions and literally years of consultation with epidemiologists at the University of Queensland. So the sorts of questions we were asking were, which heat wave metric correlates most with mortality? How is excess mortality computed? Do we look at all deaths across the entire heat wave or just a subset of days during the heat wave? How do we define the relationship? Is it between the extreme heat and excess mortality across an entire data set, or is it just for this specific event, which is what that 372 or 4 number was on the slide I just showed? And what deaths are considered within the bounds of normal? Now, of course, people die every day, but what is normal and what isn't, and how do we calculate that normality? Now, as a climate scientist, I wasn't expecting this barrage of questions. I knew some would come up, but these were once again quite nuanced, but also very, very important to get right. So in the end, we came up with this method, I guess, or summary of method in bold, that we defined excess mortality associated with various extreme heat percentiles in Victoria during the time period 1996 to 2015. And these were all calculated relative to the Melbourne Airport temperature station. Now, in this specific study, we are computing the extreme heat-related mortality. Now, I won't go into detail how this differs or why this is important, but there are a lot of different ways to calculate or estimate mortality rates relative to heat. Now, we got a number much, much lower than what I showed on the previous slide. We got 31 extra deaths when we used this method, but this particular number is all deaths specifically due to heat only. It's not due to excess deaths. It's not due to accidents induced by heat. It was people who purely died from heat alone. And this is an important distinction to make. So this figure is showing basically what our death rates were relative to different temperature percentiles, and how these percentiles resulted in an increased relative risk of death rates when those percentiles occurred. Now, over this particular event, over a number of days, we got 231 excess deaths. Now, once again, that's a much larger number than that 31 deaths that we're going to attribute. But that was because these were overall excess deaths as opposed to deaths just due to extreme heat. Now, I'm not going to go into detail with the model setup that we used for this study, but I just wanted to show that we're actually using a lot of different climate models, those that are atmospheric, as well as those that are somewhat like the Dharmic model ensemble group. And we decided to do this because most attribution assessments, even those on impacts, are commonly done with just one climate model. That is starting to change these days. But we thought it was best to use as many climate models as we could to estimate the uncertainty in the attributable signal. Now, what I wanted to show here, this is looking at 8 different model ensembles that we used, 8 different models from 2 different types of ensembles that we used. Now, what I wanted you to get from here is you can see here that in most cases, there's a significant difference between the changes in return levels of excess heat deaths in the factual, which is the red plume, and the counterfactual, which is the blue plume. And this is the case for all climate models. Now, you will see here that the difference in the return period of this death rate of 31 does change in each of the different models. Some say it's 1 in 40 years now, others say it's 1 in 27 years. But you will see, you will pick up that there is a significant or an attributable increase relative to anthropogenic influence projected by each of the climate models. So what I wanted you to get from this is, even though the specifics of the specifics of the signal relative to climate change differs from model to model, overall they detect a significant increase in this event in terms of its magnitude and return level because of anthropogenic influence on the climate. So quantitatively, they all say different things, but quantitatively, they all say the same thing, which I think brings strength into our results. And should be something that we really should consider when we're looking at impacts attribution further down the line. Okay, so an important caveat that I just wanted to mention, and I did touch on this briefly, that the mortality figure that we derived was a lot lower than deaths that have been reported for this event. And I gave a couple examples of figures of reported values and excess deaths earlier on. But this is because we need a transfer function to model the expected deaths simulated from the climate models. And what we looked here was statistical analysis that just looked at the mortality related to extreme heat. So the figure on the right here shows a sort of U-shaped curves that are commonly used and locally derived when we're looking at how temperature relates to changes in relative risk of mortality. Now, most studies, including this one here, when they apply this method, just look at the overall heat-related deaths. So anything above some sort of average, well, that would be the median here, and how each of the different percentiles increase that risk of heat-associated mortality. What we actually did in this study was forget about the rest of this data here and just look at the tail. So we only looked at the 95th, 97th, and 99th percentiles. And that's why our numbers were a lot smaller. So this isn't to say that our study is null and void, or at least I don't think it is, but it highlights how the different methods, particularly when we're estimating the impacts, are really important for the results that we get. So I'll just finish up in the last couple of slides. I think in terms of impacts attribution, we have a lot of responsibilities moving forward. It does all come down to framing, and this is really important when we're defining the impacts that we're going to attribute to climate change. I didn't touch on this really, but models aren't perfect, although you did kind of see that when we got those different attributable results behind the mortality estimate of the 2009 Australian heatwave. But on top of that, the transfer functions to estimate the impacts aren't perfect and are also quite plentiful. Now, I do want to pose a question to you. Are we at a stage where attribution can inform loss and damage of climate change? And you can define loss and damage either in terms of impacts, either in terms of economic impacts or also impacts to human life as well. I would personally say we're not quite there yet. We're certainly on our way and, creating all these sorts of methods and doing all these sorts of fantastic studies. But certainly in the case of impacts attribution, we're really just at the beginning. We're nowhere near the end yet. Also, when we're performing impacts attribution, there's a huge language barrier between climate scientists and experts in that specific impact. I had many conversations trying to explain what a climate model is and why we can't usually just use one model for climate projections in the future. And similarly, there were a lot of backwards conversations about how we estimate impacts and why it's important to do it certain ways. So really, when we're talking about impacts attribution, it's an interdisciplinary assessment. And this is something that really needs much more coordinated programs that are coordinated at high levels to really be pulled off properly. So with that, I'll leave my talk there and I'm happy to take questions if there are any. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Thanks for your excellent talk. It's quite excited. I mean, I'm excited to see the impact attribution results. So I have a very fast question about your opinion about how far we have done in the study of the impact attribution study. Yeah.
Sorry, can you just say that again?
So how, I mean, how I want to know where do we stand, where the impact attribution currently is. So how do we to promote the attribution study in the future?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I think, look, I still think we're still at the beginning stages of the field. So I still think for the most part, we've still got a lot more research to do to work out how we approach impacts attribution, how this might differ for different impacts of climate change. Are there any sort of protocols and methodologies that we can work out? How do we collaborate best with people who are the experts in the impacts? Yes. I kind of think that we're kind of at a similar situation to the first extreme event attribution studies of a couple of decades ago. They started that field and they did a good job in commencing that field. But, now we're so much further along the line in terms of impacts attribution now. And extreme event attribution now. And I think impacts attribution is still very much at the beginning. It may move, and it possibly will move a lot faster than how extreme event attribution moved. But I do think we have a lot more issues to iron out over the next, 5 to 10 years before we can get it into something that's readily used outside of climate science and the academic literature. Yeah, I totally agree. So there is a question from the audience. Say, sure. I thought climate models are generally not designed to predict specific local events as used here. So is that correct? Yeah. Yeah, look, and it depends on the event and it depends on the climate model that you're looking at. So you wouldn't want to be using global climate models for tropical cyclones or hurricanes, for example. You want to use really fine-scaled regional models that, have a resolution on the order of, a few kilometres to get those sorts of events correct. And that's what is used when we do attribution of hurricanes or cyclones and also the impacts that they ensue. Something like heat waves are more general. They do cover a wider area. Global climate models do a reasonable job of simulating heat waves. So we do think they get a lot of the processes right. But it's not an answer for, it's not the same answer for every event and every impact. It depends. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah. So we'll move to the next talk. Thank you again. Yeah. So the next speaker is Wenxia Zhang. She is an associate professor at the Institute of Atmospheric Physics, Chinese Academy of Sciences. Her research interests cover climate change attribution and projection, with a focus on climate streams, global monsoons, and water cycle. She is a member of the WCIP Lighthouse activity on explaining and predicting Earth system change, and the CMIP7 Detection Attribution Model Intercomparison Project Scientific Steering Committee. Her talk is Attribution of Precipitation Events at Different Timescales. Wenxia, please share your slide. Thank you.
Thank you, Lixia, for the invitation. And hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to share our work on the attribution of precipitation events with particular attention on the different timescales of events. And we have been increasingly hit by various extreme climates in recent years across the world. And it is concluded in IPCC AR6 that it is indisputable that human activities are causing climate change, making extreme climate events, including heat waves, heavy rainfall, and droughts, more frequent and severe. And in terms of the human contribution to the observed change, this map shows an assessment of changes in hot extremes. Here, the shading indicates the direction of observed change since 1950s, and the number of dots indicates our confidence in the human contribution. So for hot extremes, it is clear that almost over all continental regions, hot extremes have increased since 1950s, and there is medium to high confidence that the observed increase can be attributed to human contribution. But the observed change in heavy precipitation is less significant. For only about half of the regions, heavy rainfall have increased since 1950s. And there's only low confidence in human contribution due to limited agreements or limited evidence. And indeed, comparing different types of extreme events, our confidence in the attribution of extreme precipitation is much lower than for extreme temperature. And this is related to the limited understanding of the effect of climate change on extreme precipitation. So overall, there are several challenges in the attribution of extreme precipitation, including the limited quality and quantity of observations, the complex physical processes underlying extreme precipitation, as well as the limited model capability in simulating extreme precipitation. Thus, for the attribution of extreme precipitation, we need to consider comprehensively the physical processes of extreme precipitation, as well as model capability in reproducing the dynamics of extreme precipitation. And both of them contribute to the confidence in the attribution results. So in this talk, we will discuss 3 questions regarding extreme precipitation change, including the detection of long-term change, event attribution, and change in precipitation variability. The first question is, how has a long-term change in extreme precipitation emerged from climate noise? So this is the question of detecting long-term change in extreme precipitation. And here we'll first focus on global monsoon regions, because the monsoon regions are heavily affected by extreme precipitation. This figure shows the domain of global monsoons. So this is a planetary scale system characterized by a seasonal reversal of precipitation and low-level winds. And partly due to the monsoon activities, extreme precipitation over the monsoon regions is much stronger than that over the rest of the land. So it is important to understand how extreme precipitation over the monsoon region has changed in the past. Here we investigated the long-term trend in extreme precipitation, the annual max one-day precipitation over the past century, based on several global and regional scale observational data sets. And here the dark blue and red dots indicate stations showing significant increases and decreases in extreme precipitation. So over the global land monsoon region as a whole, most stations have experienced a significant increase in trend in extreme precipitation than those showing decrease. Then the question is whether the observed change is associated with observed global warming or just due to climate noise. To answer this question, we compare the observed change in extreme precipitation, which is measured here by the response to the observed temperature change over different monsoon regions. And we compare the observed change with the changes that can be expected due to climate noise alone. And the latter is estimated from bootstrapping. So the comparison shows that, for example, for the global monsoon region as a whole, the observed increase in extreme precipitation is significantly different from that due to climate noise alone. So that means a significant association with global warming can be detected for the global monsoon region. And this can also be detected for most of the regional monsoons, including the South African, South Asian, and North and South American monsoon regions. So to summarize, extreme precipitation has increased systematically in global monsoon regions over the past century, which is significantly associated with observed global warming. And apart from the long-term trend, another widely concerned question, especially after a specific event has occurred, is how has anthropogenic forcing affected specific extreme events? So this is the science of event attribution. It addresses whether and to what extent human-induced climate change has affected specific events. And in terms of the anthropogenic influence on extreme precipitation, our results show that event scale matters. In other words, the anthropogenic influence on extreme precipitation is dependent on the scales of extreme precipitation events. For example, here we show a study for the persistent heavy rainfall event in the summer of 2018 in central China. So this region is located in the marginal East Asian monsoon region. And this rainfall, the heavy rainfall lasted for about 1 month, and the accumulated rainfall over 4 weeks' time correspond to a 1 in 60-year event in observations. And this persistent heavy rainfall is directly related to a stronger than normal Western North Pacific subtropical high, which induced enhanced southerly moisture transport to this region. So we conducted an event attribution based on atmosphere-only attribution runs using the HAJAM3 model. And specifically, we look at two aspects of this heavy rainfall event. One is the persistency. So this is represented by the RX28-day index, which depicts the maximum accumulated precipitation over 4 weeks' time in summer. And the other is the daily intensity of extreme rainfall. So we first evaluated this model before doing event attribution in terms of the statistics and atmospheric circulation anomalies related to the heavy precipitation. And this evaluation shows that the model can simulate well both the statistics and atmospheric circulation anomalies related to the heavy precipitation. So this gives us confidence in the attribution results based on this model. And here we show the attribution results. The top and bottom rows show the attribution of daily and monthly extreme precipitation, respectively. So for daily extreme precipitation, the comparison between simulations under all forcing and natural forcings show that anthropogenic forcing has increased the risk of daily extreme rainfall. And this is dominated by the increased atmospheric moisture under anthropogenic forcing. But on the other hand, for monthly scale persistent heavy rainfall, anthropogenic forcing actually reduced its risk. And this is consistent with the reduction of the large-scale East Asian summer monsoon circulation, as well as summer mean rainfall. So the comparison between these two types of extreme precipitation events shows that the anthropogenic forcing, anthropogenic influence on extreme precipitation depends on the scales of events. It increased the risk of daily extreme precipitation, which is dominated by the thermodynamic processes, but it decreased the risk of persistent heavy precipitation, and this is dominated by the dynamic processes related to the large-scale East Asian summer monsoon circulation. And this similar conclusion is also found in a similar case, which is the persistent heavy May rainfall in the summer of 2020. And the attribution runs from the CMS68 MIP also shows that anthropogenic forcing has reduced the risks of persistent heavy rainfall in East China. And to further investigate the roles of greenhouse gases and anthropogenic aerosol forcings, we compare the simulations under individual forcings. So firstly, we compare the historical simulations with aerosol simulations. The difference between them can arise from greenhouse gas forcing and land use and land cover change, as well as ozone. And in East Asia, according to previous studies, the difference between them is dominated by greenhouse gas forcing. So this comparison suggests that greenhouse gas forcing increases monthly scale persistent heavy rainfall in East Asia. And secondly, we compared the historical with HGHG forcings. And again, their difference is dominated by anthropogenic aerosol forcing. And the comparison shows that anthropogenic aerosols decreases the monthly scale persistent heavy rainfall. So this comparison shows that there is a tug of war between greenhouse gases and anthropogenic aerosol forcings in the change of persistent heavy rainfall. And particularly for East Asia, the net effect is dominated by aerosol forcing, so which leads to a reduction in persistent heavy rainfall under anthropogenic forcing. And we can summarize these processes using this schematic. The anthropogenic influence on extreme precipitation is dependent on the scales of events because the dominant processes are different. For daily extreme precipitation, anthropogenic forcing has increased its probability, and this is dominated by the greenhouse gas forcing, so thermodynamic processes related to increases in atmospheric moisture. On the other hand, for persistent heavy rainfall, anthropogenic forcing has reduced its probability in East Asia, and this is dominated by anthropogenic aerosol forcing through dynamic processes related to the changes in large-scale East Asian monsoon circulation. So this highlights the importance of process-based attribution, particularly for extreme precipitation. Finally, we move on to the change in precipitation variability under global warming. This is important because change in variability is highly relevant to extremes. We know climate change can alter the main state and variability of a climate variable, and a larger variability is usually associated with intensified extremes. And for precipitation variability in particular, an amplified variability suggests amplified wet and dry extremes and wider transitions between wet and dry conditions. and also the water resources might become less reliable. So this is highly relevant for climate resilience. Climate variability exists at a wide variety of scales, ranging from synoptic, monthly, intra-seasonal to interannual, and even to decadal and multi-decadal timescales. So here we systematically investigated the changes in precipitation variability at these different timescales using a perturbed physics ensemble based on HyGEM3 model. And it provides simulations from 1900 to 2100, and the projections are under the RCP 8.5 scenario. So here we show the response of precipitation variability to global warming and for different time scales. And the blue and red shading suggests increases and decreases in precipitation variability. And clearly that precipitation variability will increase over most of global regions, except over some subtropical descending regions. And also notably, this increase in precipitation variability is quite consistent across these different time scales. And comparing changes in precipitation variability with mean precipitation, you might be very familiar with this wet get wetter pattern, which describes mean precipitation change. So that is to say that climatologically wet regions will receive more rainfall under global warming. And what we show here for the precipitation variability change is actually quite similar to the wet get wetter pattern in terms of large-scale spatial pattern. So generally, over climatologically wet regions, the precipitation will become more variable. So this pattern can be summarized as a wet gets more variable pattern in terms of precipitation variability change. And looking more closely, regionally, we can find that precipitation variability increases over a wider spatial extent than does mean precipitation. For example, for some subtropical descending regions where mean precipitation is expected to decrease, precipitation variability will still increase. And quantitatively, the increase in precipitation variability is about twice as large as the increase in mean precipitation in terms of global mean. And then why does precipitation variability amplify under global warming? We use a moisture budget equation, and the rho equation is suitable for diagnose mean precipitation. So we adjusted this equation to make it suitable for diagnosing standard deviation. And then the change in precipitation variability can be decomposed into three components, including the thermodynamic, which is related due to change in specific humidity alone. And this term is related to change in atmospheric moisture. And the second is a dynamic term due to change in circulation alone. So this term is related to change in atmospheric circulation variability. And the third term is a nonlinear term, which is due to the simultaneous change in humidity and circulation. And they are related to processes such as latent heating feedbacks. And the decomposition shows that the increased precipitation variability is dominated by the thermodynamic effect. So that is due to the increase in atmospheric moisture. And this effect is generally uniform across the globe. And the second contribution is the nonlinear term. And this term is mostly positive over the globe. And the thermodynamic and nonlinear increases in precipitation variability is partly offset by the dynamic term, which is negative over the globe except over the equatorial East Pacific. So this is due to a weakened circulation variability under global warming. And finally, by by combining the changes in precipitation variability and mean precipitation, we can identify different regimes of precipitation change. And here, the different colors indicate different regimes of precipitation change. So, for example, over most of global regions, which is also the climatologically wet regions, including 2/3 of land area, the precipitation will become wetter and more variable in the future. And over subtropical descending regions, the precipitation will either become drier but more variable, or drier and less variable. And these different regimes of precipitation change imply different impacts on water resources and natural and human systems. And so they can provide useful information for regional adaptation planning. Okay, so to briefly summarize for the third part, the precipitation variability will increase under global warming across daily to multi-year timescales, and the large-scale pattern can be described as a wet-get more variable paradigm. And this increased precipitation variability is dominated by thermodynamic and nonlinear effects, but partly offset by weakened circulation variability. Okay, thank you for attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Wenxia. A very good talk. So here is a question that, so it's very interesting to see the classified regimes of precipitation change. So can you say more about what are the implications of different regimes in terms of hydrological impacts?
Thank you for the question. Very interesting question. So these different regimes of precipitation change are identified based on changes in precipitation variability and mean state. So it describes different regimes of what regional water cycle change. So maybe relevant to water resources and natural and ecosystems. So for example, most of the climatologically wet regions will experience a wetter and more variable hydroclimate. So that means while the total precipitation amount will increase, which favors more fresh water availability, but meanwhile, the temporal distribution of precipitation will become more uneven. That is, wet periods getting wetter and dry periods getting drier. So that means the water availability may become less reliable in terms of temporal distribution. So future water management needs to consider such intensified temporal variation in order to ensure a reliable supply of water resources.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Okay, because of time limit, we have to move on to the next talk. Thanks again, Wenxia. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. The next speaker is Qiaohong. She is currently a professor in the School of Atmospheric Science at Nanjing University of Information Science and Technology in China. Her research interests include climate change detection attribution of extreme events. He was serving as contributing authors of Chapter 11 of the Working Group 1 of the 6th assessment report of IPCC. So let's welcome Qiaohong's talk.
Hi everyone, it is my pleasure to give a talk here. Today I'm going to talk about attributions and future projection of changes in extreme precipitation across the globe. I will talk about introductions observed changes, attributions, and future projections on extreme precipitation. It is well known to observe the increase in world maximum greenhouse gas concentration since around 1750 are caused by human activities and non-induced global warming. Extreme events happen everywhere and then affect everyone in different ways. And it is becoming clear that these events are becoming more frequent and more damaging with climate warming. Among many extreme events, extreme precipitation is one of the most extensive disaster events. It is affecting many countries in the world. There are some recent examples. Atmospheric river brought several days extreme precipitation to BC in the fall of 2021 and then induced floods in BC. It blocked all roads, pipeline connections between Vancouver and the rest of the country. Also in July, European countries were affected by extreme rainfalls and floods, killed at least 157 people in Germany alone. Henan province in China was also affected by extreme precipitation and floods in July. Extreme precipitation can induce floods and cause damages to property and infrastructure and even loss of life. Saturation vapor pressure is a quasi-exponentially increasing function of temperature. Warmer air can hold more moisture. Extreme precipitation is most affected by the availability of atmospheric moisture and generally increased at the CC rate. It is important to know how extreme precipitation changes in a warming climate state. Therefore, in the first part, we look into changes in extreme precipitation. We use the MK test to see if there is a statistically significant change in the X 1-day and 5-day series during the 1950 to 2018 period. Figures on left side show the spatial distributions of trends in IX 1-day based on over 7,000 stations. Light blue and red open dots indicate non-significant increasing or decreasing trends, respectively. Dark blue and red felt dots indicate statistically significant trends. In total, there are about 2/3 of stations showing increasing trends and close to 1/3 showing decreasing trends in X 1-day or 5-day. In terms of spatial pattern, even though the spatial distributions of stations with significant increasing trends is slightly ridden, there is the slightly higher concentrations in the Eastern North America, Europe, Southeast China, and South Africa. On the other hand, we also calculate the percentage of stations showing significant increase or decrease in trends. The red dots indicate the observed results, and the blue chart indicates 1,000 bootstraps from bootstrapped samples. It is obvious that the observed result is far away from the blue chart for stations with significant increase. However, the percentage of stations showing significant decrease trend is close to the ridden trends. So intensifications was statistically significant at about 10% of them, which is 4 times higher than the impacts in the unchanging climate. Then, for each station, we calculate the percentage changes in annual extreme precipitation per 1 Kelvin degree changes of global mean surface temperature. This is Damley sensitivity value. Then, taking all the stations together, we calculate the median sensitivity value of all the stations and watch, as shown in the red dots. We find a 6.6% increase in intensity in X 1 day. The values are significantly greater than 0. It is consistent with Cauchy's pattern CC relations. And the results for X 1 day are similar to X 5 day are similar to X 1 day. Then, this figure shows the percentage of stations with significant increasing or decreasing trends. And the blue for increasing, but the red is the decreasing trend over the 6 continents. And where gauges continental domains, including Asia, Europe, North America, we can find the intensifications of X 1 day and X 5 day. In Asia, Europe, and North America, the sensitivity values of observed extreme precipitation and global temperature is significantly greater than 0, and their sensitivities value are also close to CC range. However, in the Africa, South Americans, the number of stations is small, although the number of stations with significant increase is higher than that of stations with significant decrease, but don't pass the felt significance test due to the small number of symbols and greater uncertainties. Then we find changes in extreme precipitation. And inevitable, we would like to know if climate change caused by human activities has affected changes in extreme precipitation. And we also want to know if external influence can be detected at regional scales. So we continue to carry out studies on detection and attributions on temporal and spatial changes in extreme precipitation. We used X 1 day and 5 days from station datasets in our first part. To consider long-term changes, we only used about 5,000 stations with more than 45 years of data during the 1950 to 2014 period, including at least 3 years during the 2010 and 2014 period. We use the large ensemble simulations of KMS2, and the large ensembles have 50 members. We also use multimodal climate simulations from CMAP6. We use simulations with all forcing, there is anthropogenic and natural forcing combined, and simulations with natural forcings. We choose the models that have at least 3 ensemble members for both all forcing and natural forcing, and total 10 models from CMAP6 meet the requirements and provide a total 46 runs for each forcing. At the continental scale, we divide the global land areas into 4 continents as inferior studies, including the Western North Hemisphere land areas, NA, Eurasia, EU, Eastern Eurasia, AS, and the Oceanians, OC. At the regional scales, we choose the 16 regions of IPCC6. In each region, there are more than 30 stations. So for the detection and attribution methods, extreme value theory suggests that the behavior of observed annual extremes can be fed with zero distribution. GV distribution have location, scale, and self-parameters. Non-stationary behavior can be represented by treating these parameters as functions of covariates that alter the characteristics of extremes. And detection and attribution analysis, the parameters of the GV distributions can be treated as a function of climate change signal estimated from global model simulations, and to determine whether the observations provide evidence for the repression of the net signals. Thus, we use the non-stationary GV distributions to do the DF analysis. We fit the GV distribution to log transport observations, log X1 day and log X5 day. We assumed that the scale and subparameters varies only with geographical locations. And then the GV location parameters varies with geographical locations and the time as the following functions. Well, the beta is the scaling factor, and this term is the signal from different forces of interest from climate model output. It can be expressed as the ratio between the median X1 or X5 at 10 and then the factor difference 10. And then based on these functions, we estimate the scaling factor of signal from different forcing. If the corresponding scaling factor is significant, greater than 0, a response to external forcing is said to be detected. If the corresponding confidence interval also covers erratics, attribution is considered. This is result. We conduct two signal analyses. We separately account for the natural forcing signal and anthropogenic forcing signal. Over the global land areas and continents, including AS, NA, and EU, anthropogenic scaling factor are significant greater than 0 when using both the KMS2 or CMAP6 signals. And X1 day results are very similar to those of X1 day. Natural signals are however not detected when using signals for both CMAP simulations. This figure shows the best estimate of scaling factor and their 1950 bootstrap confidence intervals for two signal detections in 16 regions. The anthropogenic signal is the best detected in X1 day over 7 regions using both the KMS2 or CMAP6 signals. 7 regions include North Europe, Eastern Europe, with the spurious Central North Americans, Eastern North Americans, East Central Asia, East Asia. Then this figure shows the estimate waiting time in the 2010 to 2014 climate stage for 20-year events in 1950 to 1954 climate stage. For example, globally, the waiting time tends to decrease in the 21st century. The waiting time for 20-year events reduced to about 16 years in the 2010 to 2014 climate stage. It means that extremes that once happened every 20 years became to happen more often. The largest changes in the likelihood of extreme precipitation are observed in the EU at the continental scale and North and North Europe and regional scale, which may be related to the substantial warming that have happened in these regions. With climate warming, the 1 in 20, 50, and 100-year extreme precipitation events that guide the designs of the water infrastructures are expected to occur more frequently, as well as with more intensity. Next, to look into future changes in extreme precipitation, we use the 3 CMAX global models that have provided large ensemble simulations. We would like to know if extreme precipitation under our onshore years will intensify in the future or not. Thus, we used onshore index that is obtained by spatially averaging the smooth anomalies over the La Nina 3.4 regions. And we classified El Nino year, natural years, and La Nina years. And we use the risk ratio to evaluate the changes of the probabilities of extreme events in the future period relative to the historical period. And then we first evaluate the performance of these models and the CESM2 models for next step analysis, since it performs slightly better than the other models. Compared to the historic period, the likelihood of extreme precipitation experienced historic natural El Nino La Nina conditions is projected increase in the future conditions in the most regions. For instance, events with the intensity of historical El Nino 20-year events are projected to happen more than 3 times as often in the future El Nino years in most land areas, with the risk ratio greater than 3 for 20-year events. Similar results can be found in future natural La Nina years relative to historical natural La Nina years, respectively. In terms of changes in the variabilities of extreme precipitation, we look into changes in onshore-driven variations, onshore-driven extreme precipitation variations. And results shows increasing in onshore driving extreme precipitation variations. The third figures is for the field. This figures is for the changes in onshore driven variations. So we can find that there is an increase in onshore driven extreme precipitation variation. Therefore, the disparity of extreme precipitation between El Nino and La Nina will increase with warming in these regions. On the other hand, extreme precipitation intensified under all onshore years in these regions. Next, this figure shows the regional average of the contributions of thermodynamic and dynamic components to the changes in onshore driver variation. Each component is normalized by the historical onshore driven extreme precipitation variation. However, the dynamic component offsetting or even reducing the thermodynamic induced changes in other regions. This is our conclusions. Extreme precipitation have intensified over global, continental, and regional scales. The intensifications of one day of 5-day precipitation extremes at a global scale is consistent with CC Leach. Attribution studies show that anthropogenic influence leads to more intense precipitation extremes. And extreme precipitation is greater than historical thresholds will become more common throughout the annual cycle. The disparities and the magnitudes of extreme precipitation events that happen under different annual conditions will increase. And the dynamic component produce strong regional difference in the response to forcing. And the infrastructure must be adapted, not only a manage of 17 climates, but a broader range of climate variation in a global warming climate state. Thank you very much. This is the reference paper. Thank you.
Thank you, Qiaohong. Very good talk about. So your talk and Wenxia's talk have some overlap, and you well explained the influence of ENSO. So here is a very first question as going. So in the observation, say more stations shows increasing trends than the station with decreasing trend. So, and most importantly, there's sensitivity of precipitation over East Asia is higher than some other regions. Could you please explain some further about this question?
You mean the sensitivity value is higher than in East Asia?
Yes.
Note in my results, and the sensitivity values in East Asia is lower than other regions. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. So I think, as the mentioned in the Wenxia, also influence maybe reduce the sensitivity values. With global warming, I think is one of the factors. And other. On the other side, I think some circulation changes, maybe monsoon changes, also affect the sensitivity values. But I think it's more researches about on it. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Very good talk. So there's no questions in the lab. So thank you again. So we will move to the next talk. Thank you, Qiaohong. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So the next speaker is Dr. Nicholas Leach. He is a researcher at the University of Oxford and a climate scientist at Climate X Ltd. His research lies at the intersection of weather prediction and climate risk, focusing on how we can use numerical weather forecast models to better understand and quantify human influence on extreme weather events. His work to date has largely concerned heat waves and storms, and at the moment he is particularly interested in going beyond the meteorology of extreme weather and into the social-economic impacts it causes. His talk is focus-based windstorm attribution. So let's welcome Dr. Nicholas. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. No, not yet.
Sorry, we're just having some problems with sharing the slides.
You can't see your slide.
Okay.
It works.
Yeah. Can you see my slides and can you hear me okay?
Yes, very good. Yeah.
Okay, great. Sorry about that. I had a few technical difficulties, but yeah. So today I'm going to be talking about some work in which we are using a novel approach to kind of the traditional statistical approaches or approaches using climate models. We're using operational weather forecasts, and so there are a number of reasons why we would do that, and I will basically go into those during the course of my talk. And so this is work that a lot of the case study that I'm going to talk about has been done by Sharon Ernest at the University of Oxford, and it's also with some other collaborators from Oxford, the European Centre for Medium Range Weather Forecasts, and the Met Office. And so if we go to the next slide. Yeah, so I thought I'd just start with basically a statement saying that extreme weather attribution is hard. So the weather is chaotic and complex, and trying to disentangle what impact we're having on it is an extremely difficult question to try and answer. And so the initial way that often kind of would be the most natural question to ask after an extreme weather event happens is, did climate change cause this event? And so because the weather is so complex and chaotic, this is a near impossible question to actually answer, whether there is a specific kind of causal link between human influence and a weather event. And so what we have to do is we have to work out actually what question do we want to ask? Do we want to ask, and do we want to try and answer after a weather event has happened? And so there are two kind of broad frameworks that are used to try and decide what question we're actually trying to answer. And so if we go to the next slide, then I'll talk about those. So these two approaches are often called kind of either risk-based or probabilistic approach to attribution, and the storyline approach. And so in the risk-based approach, you say, well, my extreme weather event has happened, and I want to understand how climate change or human influence on the climate has affected the probability of that event. And because trying to assess how it's changed the probability of that one unique event is impossible or incredibly difficult, then what is typically done is the event is wrapped up into a class of events. So if you have a heat wave, you might say, well, I'm going to look at how climate change has affected the probability of all heat waves above a certain severity. And then you define your event using some sort of threshold and work out from your kind of event class, look at the trends in this class and see how they're getting hotter and how their probability is changing. And so in that way, you can work out or estimate how the probability has changed of the particular event, but within a class of similar events. And so this is done using statistical techniques applied to kind of trends and observations, or with generally with climate model simulations, where you rerun your climate model in a world without human influence on the climate. So you take out greenhouse gases and other influences that humans have had on the atmosphere, and you compare the probability of the event class that you're looking at in the real world, in the climate model real world, and in the climate model without human influence on the climate. And so that's one way, and that's probably, in terms of extreme weather attribution, is the more the older version. So that was kind of the original idea behind extreme weather attribution. And the newer way of looking at it is what's often called the storyline approach. And so this is a way that's not just used in extreme weather attribution, but other fields as well. And so this says, well, I'm going to look at my specific event, and I'm going to build up a picture of what drivers were particularly important for that event. So if it's a heat wave or a particular kind of extreme season in Europe, you might look at something like the North Atlantic Oscillation. But it's saying, I'm going to look at each of those drivers, and I'm going to try and work out how humans have influenced each of the specific drivers in order to build up a picture of how we have kind of influenced the final outcome of that particular specific extreme weather event. And so rather than wrapping up your event in a class like you do in the probabilistic approach, this one, it's very conditional and it's deterministic, and at least so far I haven't seen studies where this has been used to try and estimate probabilities, but it can be used to estimate changes in intensity. So for a heat wave, that might be something like a change in 1.5 degrees in the peak intensity of the heat, whereas the probabilistic approach, you tend to end up with a statistic like probably the ones that you might have seen in the news. So things like this heat wave was made 10 times more likely or 30 times more likely as a result of climate change. And so if we move on to the next slide. And so one of the other reasons why extreme weather attribution is hard is not just because you have to decide what question you're actually trying to answer, but also because it's kind of necessary to use a model at some point in your analysis. I mean, so the first bullet point, there is no second Earth, so we can't directly observe an Earth in which we haven't been emitting greenhouse gases. And so in order to kind of provide that alternative reality to try and work out how the probability or the intensity of our event is changing, we need an estimate of what the world would have looked like without human influence on the climate. And so that's where climate models come in, and they are fantastic, but they do have deficiencies, particularly when it comes to extremes. And so that's another reason why this is a particularly hard endeavor, is because you're trying to use these models that we know have these issues with some sorts of extremes in order to kind of work out what humans have been doing to extreme weather events. And so this is where I go on to talk about, rather than kind of intro, talk about what we've done. And so if we go to the next slide, this is where in my work, so during my PhD and carrying on now at Oxford, we have been looking at seeing whether you can use weather forecasts. So rather than using climate models, where they are unconditioned, they're run kind of for a very long periods of time, we use initialized weather forecasts. So these are built to predict specific things. And so this is sort of the short list of why you might want to think about using weather forecasts. So generally, they run at a much higher resolution. They can simulate more processes and more of the important processes in extreme weather events. They are highly validated, and so one of the key reasons why you might want to use weather forecasts is because you can say, well, I'm interested in this extreme weather event. Was my weather forecast actually able to predict it? And if it was, then you have a pretty good level of confidence with a little bit of checking that it's able to simulate the process that are important for the event you're actually looking at. A third reason, which I'm not going to go into any more in this talk, is that weather forecasts are already operational. And so if you want to be able to do this routinely, so for any kind of extreme weather event, we want to say after it's happened, what humans have done to it, then weather forecasts might be a reasonable way to go because they're already operational. They run all the time. And so we might be able to use them on an operational basis for attribution as well. And the final reason is that with weather forecasts, you choose a lead time. And so the closer you are to a particular extreme weather event, the more tightly conditioned, assuming the weather forecast is able to predict it at all, the more tightly conditioned you are on that extreme weather event. And so on very short lead times, weather forecasts can get at what the storyline approach to attribution is trying to answer. It's that very conditioned picture of the event, like what has climate change done to this specific event. But if you move further out to kind of weekly or even seasonal timescales, then weather forecasts are much less conditioned, and so you can start to get at the probabilistic view of attribution. It's this synthesis between the two frameworks that is quite interesting for using weather forecasts. And so here's the next slide, which I think has, it has a video, unfortunately, because I'm not showing the slide, but someone else says you can't see the video. But basically, this is here I'm going to get at why weather forecasts are good from a point of view of validation. So that's this point of, I have an extreme weather event that I'm interested in. Was my weather forecast actually able to capture it? So, and you can say, you can look at your forecast and basically say pretty quickly and fairly easily, was I able to predict it? Are the processes in the forecast correct? Do we understand if the model has weaknesses with these kinds of events? Because weather forecasts used operationally, we have generally for a lot of things, we have a very good idea of where they are actually weak already, unlike for a lot of the time climate models, where you might have to do a whole new analysis to work out if the model is actually good at. And if the model is able to predict an event, then with a little bit more checking, like I've said, you can work out if it's able to simulate those key physical processes that drove the event you're interested in. And so if you were able to play this video, which unfortunately you're not, then you would see the kind of differences in resolution between a typical climate model and a typical weather forecast model. And basically this shows that, kind of gives an illustration of weather forecasts being able to simulate more processes. And so if we go to the next slide, I will very quickly go over the experiment design. So what we do is we take the operational forecasting system, so the ensemble prediction system from the European Centre for Weather Forecasts, which is a probabilistic forecasting system. So it has 51 ensemble members, and these are used to assess the probability of particular weather events happening. And then what we do with that, the exact operational setup is we change the level of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we also perturb the 3D ocean state. So it's a coupled model. So we change all levels of the ocean using an estimate of what human influence has basically done to the temperature of the ocean so far. And we also adjust the salinity to avoid kind of spurious mixing in the ocean starting as soon as we initialize our model. And we do this both going backwards, so reducing the temperatures in the ocean and reducing the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere to come up with an estimate of what the pre-industrial climate state would be. And we do it also the opposite direction, exact same changes, but opposite direction to have this kind of pseudo future look. And we put that initial state back into the forecast model, so this perturbed pre-industrial initial state, and then we just rerun the forecast and see what happens to our extreme weather event of interest. And if we move on, then I'm going to go into some kind of interesting bit, so some results, which is we've been looking at Storm Eunice, which is a storm that happened in the UK in February 2022. And so this is the bit where the work has been done by Sharon at Oxford, and so kind of not just another heat wave. So far, all of my work has been done on heat waves, and it's great and it's been very interesting. But kind of heat waves have been done to death a bit in attribution, and they're seen as probably the easy kind of event to try and attribute because the signal is so strong. And so we thought, why don't we try and do something a bit more difficult? And so we're looking at the storm. And if we move to the next slide, then I've got a bit of background to the storm. It was a bomb cyclone, so it intensified incredibly rapidly on the 16th of February in the North Atlantic before moving across to hit the UK on the 18th, so just 2 days later. It caused between £2 and £4 billion of loss across Europe. Saw peak observed wind gusts in excess of 120 miles an hour in the UK, which is incredibly strong. And so this picture shows the Millennium Dome, or the O2, the Millennium Dome, which is a kind of famous landmark in London. And this is what the result of Storm Eunice. And so it was an incredibly strong storm. But if we go to the next slide, another interesting thing is that, which again is a video, so you're not going to be able to see it, but it was incredibly well forecast. So before the storm had even formed, the European Centre's ensemble prediction system had a pretty good sense that there was going to be an incredibly strong storm. And so as a result of this, which if you're in the UK, you might remember, we had a series of very successful weather warnings. So the Met Office was able to put out kind of high risk alerts well in advance of the storm actually happening. And so this video compares the forecast to the reanalysis and basically shows that the system was able to predict it very well. So unfortunately you can't see that, but we'll move on. And so if we go to the next slide. So this is the experiment. So I've said that that's what we do. We change the initial state of the forecast model and just rerun it using from that perturbed initial state. And so if you do this, so we do that for 3 different lead dates. So a 2 days before the storm hits the UK, which is an extremely tightly conditioned, very good forecast. So almost exactly happens, exactly how the storm did actually occur. Then 4 days in advance. So this is before the storm had actually formed in the North Atlantic, but it's still a good forecast. And then 8 days where you're getting much less conditioned on the kind of specific features of the event. But in most forecast numbers, you do still have a kind of storm occurring. And so this figure shows the storm tracks. So tracks using a commonly used tracking algorithm. And so the top picture shows the tracks in our pre-industrial, where we've cooled the ocean and reduced the level of CO2 in that forecast. The present day shows the tracks in the different members of the operational forecast. And the bottom one shows the future storm tracks. And so one thing that's kind of interesting is there are fewer in the pre-industrial. So based on how we've kind of defined what is storminess in terms of depth of how deep the mean sea level pressure is and how strong the vorticity was, we actually end up picking out fewer storms in the pre-industrial one because they don't get as strong. And so if we move on to the next slide, then here are some plots of the characteristics. So we do this storm tracking. We pick out lots of different, all the storms that we have tracked in each ensemble, so in each experiment, so the pre-industrial one, the operational one, and the future experiment. So here, the pre-industrial one is represented by the blue dots, the operational, the grey, and the future is the red. And so you can see that, interestingly, essentially the storms are associated with higher wind speeds. So it gets a bit more kind of, the signal is weaker when the further out you go because you're less tightly conditioning on the storm. And so you get much more kind of noise mixed in there. And so that's why the error bars get larger when you move down to this. So the 2022-0210 is the forecast initialized on the 10th, which is 8 days before the storm hits. And so much more uncertainty there. But the broad picture is that both gusts and the peak rainfall get stronger when we kind of perturb this state into a future state, or they get, the same thing is saying they get basically climate changes appears to have made the storm stronger, both in terms of the wind speeds and the rainfall. And this also does follow through in terms of to the deepest pressure for most of the lead dates. So the storms are deeper, like the cyclone associated with the storm is deeper when you increase the level of CO2 and increase the temperature in the ocean. And then, so this is a fairly kind of intensity focused, a bit of a storyline framing of this analysis. So we're just looking at changes. So things like a 2 to 4 meter per second increase in the wind gust, but we can also look at it because we've got an ensemble forecast in a probabilistic sense. And so if you move to the next slide, then we've also done that. And so if we use the storm severity index, which is a metric of the kind of aggregate intensity of a storm, so it takes into account the spatial footprint of a storm and kind of adds up all individual grid boxes over the domain where the storm occurred. And again, you can see that from pre-industrial to present, there is a kind of significant and fairly confident increase in the distribution of storm severity index over the forecast ensemble. And so this happens at all lead dates. And the thing to say is probably that, again, the closer you are to the storm when you initialize your model, the more tightly conditioned you are on the specific storm. And so therefore, that's why this bottom plot, which is the forecast initialized 2 days before, the lines are much closer together because all the storms are much more similar. So there's much less noise, but there's also less signal. And so kind of the conclusion, which I'd say was, I don't know, probably not a surprise given previous literature, but maybe a surprise that we actually saw anything in the experiments because we weren't sure whether we would actually see any significant changes because of basically just weather noise, was that human influence increased the likelihood of a UNIS impact windstorm. And so we move on to the final slide. Final slide. What are we doing next? So at the moment, one of the kind of biggest questions around this approach, or the issues with the approach that we're currently using, is that we're changing the ocean, we're changing sea ice, and we're changing the level of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, but we're not actually reinitializing the atmosphere. And so that has to adjust over the course of the forecast. And so there is literature that suggests that it should adjust on a timescale of days, but clearly in the really short lead time, so that 2-day lead time, we're not seeing the full signal, the kind of full effect, like the equilibrium response of human influence on the climate. And that's another reason why in that last slide, those lines are so close together, is because the atmosphere is still adjusting to the changes that we've made to the forecast. So that's one thing that we're currently working on. We're also interested in, so at the moment, attribution is as it's generally done, attribution is a bit of a backward-looking thing. So you say, right, how has my event changed from the past to now? But we're interested in kind of flipping it the other way and saying, well, what if we focus on the future? So like, what would a So rather than just carrying out that future experiment as a kind of test of how monotonic the response is, which is what we've done it so far, is like targeting, well, what does this storm look, what does this event look like in a 2-degree world or a 4-degree world? And trying to look at particular kind of providing information about projections. The third one, which I mentioned briefly, is operational attribution. Could this be done operationally on a regular basis, given that forecasts are already run routinely on a regular basis by many weather forecasting centers around the world? Looking into impact attribution, so one of the nice things about weather forecasts is that by and large they have lower biases than climate models, and so the data that we produce from these experiments might be more easily used by impact models than data from climate models, where you might have to do kind of bias adjustments to get your data into a format that can be used kind of accurately by an impact model. So something like looking at the impact of heat waves on health is something that we're working on at the moment. And the final thing is, at the moment, we've done all of this with the European Centre's forecast model, but that's only a single model, and there may be structural biases in that model that mean that essentially the answers are not perfect. And so we would like to get an idea of that uncertainty, that potential structural uncertainty that's introduced by just using one model, by trying to use different models, so using other forecasting centres models and seeing basically, do they get similar results or do they get very different results? And that would be something that we're very interested in. And yeah, that's it. So thank you very much for listening, and any questions?
Thanks, Dr. Nicholas, for your so wonderful presentation. It was this talk is very valuable for the attribution for a specific extreme event. As for the DAMIP and the C20C detection attribution models can't attribute to a specific event, but for a class of events. So it's very interesting to see this forecast-based attribution result. So I have a question. Here is a question that you are going to do a operational attribution based on this forecast attribution, right? Say, I know Met Office are also doing this operational attribution using the HDM, I think. So is there any overlap between your plan and the ongoing operational attribution of Met Office?
So we are, I collaborate with people from the Met Office, and so that would be a slightly different. I mean, the Met Office is interesting because they use the same model kind of across forecast, like from weather to climate, and so their attribution model is likely to be very similar to their weather forecast model. So you get less of the benefit of kind of knowing that the model is good for a particular event by the fact that it's able to forecast it, but we are essentially working on implementing this in their seasonal forecast model. So rather than the variant of HadGem that's used for their current operational system, we would be implementing this or trying to implement this in Glossy 6, which is their seasonal forecasting, the specific version of the Hadley Center model that's used for seasonal forecasting. So similar, but not exactly the same, I think.
Okay, thank you. So very interesting to see this different operational attribution method. Yeah, thank you. So let's see, is there any questions in the? No, there's no question. So thank you, Nicholas. So we move to the next talk. Thank you again. So the next speaker is Dr. Philippe Naveau. He is a CNRS senior researcher at the Laboratory of Sciences to Climate Environment. His research interests are extreme value theory, time series analysis, spatial statistics, with main applications in statistical climatology and hydrology. He has been part of various national and international grants dealing with climate extremes analysis and statistical modeling. And his talk is Data Science Tools to Model Records. Let's welcome Philippe. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. First, I have a question. Do you have less time than everyone else? because the clock says. Okay, great.
Yeah,
Thanks.
don't worry.
Just to know.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so my talk it's about basically statistics and records in the context of detection attribution, and I have a lot of collaborators on this, but I would like to highlight Paula, who's doing a PhD on this topic with my colleagues. So I think compared to the other talks, I think here I want to focus on really high extremes, in fact, the records. And here, as you can see, it was a time series of in Canada, where you can see the temperature there was really outside of the range of previous temperature. So it was a record. Or you can see that, of course, like in rainfall data. Like this is a time series in Belgium, and you can see that the last observation is the greatest one. Okay, so that's also a record. And my main question is to say, can we deal with this record in a detection and attribution context? And is it more complex or even simpler? And also, one related question is to, and that would be mostly the focus of my talk, because I'm going to look at annual precipitation of maximum of annual precipitation. And can we detect when the change in record had occurred in the past? So basically, that's a topic I would like to address here. And if you start to think about times of emergence, then there is a really, I think, important fact that you always need a baseline. You need a reference period in some sense. And how can we get that for record? That's also a question we'd like to address in this. So to summarize, if you think about statistics in some sense, what you would like to have is like a very simple baseline, and after to have a way to say we are far away from this baseline in a significant way. So it's a point I would like to stress, it's a relative problem in some sense. You always compare to something else. And that's we are going to use that a lot during this talk. So now let's go back to the definition of a record. And in fact, it's a very simple definition. It's when you have a data set, and according to the previous reference period, the last observation is higher than the previous one, okay? So what can we say about statistics of this? And of course, if the climate was stationary, here is a toy example. For example, if you have a period of 50 years, let's say from 1900 to 1950, this is the gray area. And so you can see the red point in 1950, it's higher than all the previous points, so it's a record, okay? And of course, if you move the time period, then you will have maybe the latest observation won't be the record, but what you can see that clearly it's when at the end of the day, when what you have to do is to compute this probability. So you take the variable of interest, let's imagine that, let's call it x of t, and you want to know if before, the probability that all the observations before are smaller, okay? And during this session today, a lot of people mentioned the counterfactual, and they say, oh, it's so hard because we never observe the counterfactual. And that's true in some sense. But I think for record, it's kind of an advantage at some level. Why? Because if you think about record, and if you think basically the climate is quasi-stationary in this case, in the counterfactual, it means that this probability than the last observation compared to the rest is higher, is only 1 over r. R is the length of the period. So let me explain this equation, because maybe you are tired at the end of the session, but like suppose you are in front of a store and you see 2 people entering the store, and what's the probability that one person is higher than the second one? You will say, oh, it's 0.5 if the population is the same, basically. And of course, if you repeat the experiment, you say, oh, now there's 3 people. I have 2 people inside the store, and I would like to know what the probability that the new people coming in the store is taller than the rest, and I would be 1/3. So it's very simple computation. And the main advantage of that, to do this computation, I don't need to observe the x of t. It's always true if my time series x of t is basically stationary in time, or more precisely, it's exchangeable. Okay, so we have the baseline here. We have something very well set. It's 1/r, the length of the period, if we were in the counterfactual, basically. Okay, another advantage of this formula is the fact that it's completely relative. So for example, now suppose x of t comes from a climate model. And of course, the climate model, mimics the truth, but there is bias. And usually people, what they do bias correction. But in this case, if, for example, you have a bias like your climate model is warmer by 1 degree, or the variability is multiplied by 2, if it is true for each time step, then it doesn't change the inequality here in some sense, because this is just relative. So in some sense, if you change all the variable x of t with the same transform function, then you would have the same result. So in some sense, you can bypass bias correction of model. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to emergence time and climate change, but I think this is going to be very fast because everything has been said before me in some sense. So as Nicolas said before, we have only one Earth, and in some sense, if we want to deal with the counterfactual, we need to work with climate models or forecast model or whatever. We need proxies of the untrue. So as you know very well, usually in this detection attribution business, we have a very simple design of experiment. You have the factual world where you have your climate model and you have the all forcing, basically anthropogenic and natural forcing. And then you are looking at the climate response. Okay, and we define the counterfactual. It's simply that I remove the anthropogenic forcing and I keep the natural forcing, and now I can compare the two. Okay, so I'm not going to spend time on this. And after that, you can list, of course, different sources of problem with this framework. I'm not going to go through all of these items. What I would like to do is just to underline that in my talk, I'm going to speak about basically model error. When I say model error, is from the climate model, and also the non-stationary we have in the factual world. Okay, and I would like to stress something also. If you start to read extremes or records, then a factual rare event is very rare, of course, in the factual, but it's almost impossible in the counterfactual. Okay, so this is an issue because when you want to compute the probability, it's going to be almost zero. Okay, so how we can deal with that in the counterfactual world? So basically, the game of detection attribution, at least from the, not the storyline point of view as the previous speaker, but much more as a probability point of view, then is to say, oh, I have two distributions, the blue one and the red one, and I have a set of interests, let's say the gray area here, and I would like to see if the change between the blue and the white change the probability to be in the gray area. So that's basically the setup for detection attribution. I need a little bit of notation, but they are very simple, as you will see. I have two samples, so one from the counterfactual and one from the factual. And the distribution from the counterfactual I call G of X. G, like you can think about Gaia, the Earth Gaia without anthropogenic forcing, let's say. And the distribution of the Z is F, F like factual. Okay, so you have two distributions basically. And the game we have is to say, can we make the difference between F and G in some sense? And as a lot of speakers mentioned before, what people use, they use different ratio. the far or other thing, but basically at the end of the day, you need to compute the probability that x is greater than u when u is large, or probability of z greater than u is large. And u usually is given to you according to the observations. In our case, we are going to do something fairly different. Okay, because now what I like to do is to come back and say, I would like to speak about records. And so how can I use this framework? Because in my record, I don't have a U. I don't set a threshold. This is not the case anymore. So what I need to do is to think about this kind of graph here. So you remember I showed you this graph at the beginning where you have the time, you have a time series, which you can imagine this time series is a counterfactual. And then now we have two time series because now I have the factual. Okay, so if I move it a bit, now I have two time series. And so the game I'm going to play is the following one. So now I'm going to say, oh, in the factual world, okay, so I take now a red point here, but in the red time series, is it a record with respect to the blue one? Okay, so what's going to happen if I do that? Of course, if we have a trend, like in this data, then the fact that the latest observation, the red point here, the red diamond, is going to be a record, is going to be not 1 over r anymore, as if it was before in the counterfactual, is going to be something much higher. Okay, and the more you go in time, the more likely that this probability will increase if, for example, if you have the warming in temperature. So now the question is different in some sense. So now it's here, as I said before, people in the past tried to look at probability of x greater than u and z greater than u. Here we replace u by the max of the past observation. So now there is no u anymore, but there is the r, which is the length of the period, and we look at the probability that the last observation is greater than the past observation in the counterfactual. But in the factual, we look at the fact that the factual observation of today is greater than what could have happened in the counterfactual. So here it's a max of x. Okay? So now we have this. And we can say, well, what's the advantages and the drawbacks of doing that? So one of the big advantages of this is now I don't have to compute P0 of R in the counterfactual world because I know it's 1 over R. So I don't need to have X for that. And this, when R is large, could be very small, but I don't have any estimation error because I know exactly what it is. It's 1 over R. So I just need to compute P1 of R. So the rest of my talk is going to focus on how to compute P1 of R, which is the probability that the observation today in the factual world is greater than the last observation in the counterfactual. Okay, so is it hard to compute this? Here it's a little formula. So, but it looks complex, but you will see it's not that hard to follow if you notice something. So in my talk, I'm going to look at annual maxima of precipitation. So in the factual world, they are not stationary data. They can change because of anthropogenic forcing. But they are independent. Annual maxima of precipitation is independent in some sense. So this probability can be written as an expectation. And this expectation basically depends on the new variable which I call W. And W, what W does, and I'm going to spend a little bit, one slide or two on this, is try to morph Z into G. So I try to make the transition between the factual and the counterfactual. Okay, so so remember Z is the factual world, and if I was applying F, the distribution of factual to that, that would give me W would be an exponential distribution. But here we know that the G is different than F, so the distribution of the factual is different from the counterfactual, obviously. But we can still estimate this G because it comes from the counterfactual. So let me see how we can do that. So far, I haven't spoken too much about extreme value theory. And extreme value theory, it's a statistical field where it says the following thing. It says that if you want to study maxima, block maxima, let's say, like in my talk, I'm going to look at annual maxima of precipitation. So a good distribution, I mean, the only one that could fit well block maxima of precipitation is called the GV distribution. What you have to keep for this, either you know the distribution, so it's easy for you, or you don't know anything about that. But if you don't know anything, what you have to understand is this distribution has 3 parameters, okay? And one parameter, Xi, drives the intensity of the tail of the distribution, okay? And depending on the side, it's called the gumball or the variable of the Fresnel distribution. So now we can say, oh, if I start to think about this framework of extreme value distribution, and I suppose that X and Z are GV distribution, extreme value distribution, but they have different parameters, how this W distribution could change. And here, it's an example. If I take 2 GV and they have different parameters, let's say they have positive shape parameters, which is the case for precipitation, then if I, from these 2 distributions, if I create W, which has the red distribution, then what is nice, this is a variable distribution, and has only 2 parameters. Okay, so in some sense, what I'm saying here is like, if I have the factual word, I will have 3 parameters, plus 3 parameters for the counterfactual. But when I combine things together, at the end, I get only 2 parameters. Okay, and why? What's I mean, there is no free lunch. Why I go from a prime with 6 parameters to a prime with 2 parameters is the fact I'm looking at relative quantities, and that's reduce the number of parameters. So I'm going to use that because in subset now, if I have to do estimation, I don't have to fit any GV distribution. I just have to create W and fit the 2 parameter available distribution. Okay, so this graph summarizes basically what I'm just said. If you have the GV for the counterfactual, the GV for the factual, you put them together by this transform W, then it's a variable distribution. And with respect to other studies, if you look at most of people who have worked on statistics of extreme value for a detection attribution, they assume that the shape parameter is the same, which is not our case. So in this approach, we have more flexibility for that. Okay, so now how does it work in practice? Okay, so here I show you I take one of the CEMIT model, I take the IPSL model under scenario 8.5, and I create the W, I compute, I have the formula now to get the probability with 2 parameters. And then at the end of the day, I can compute the probability of a record with this technique. So in some sense, here I'm looking at decadal records. So what I know, if I take 10 years, if I was in the counterfactual, the chance to have a record would be 1/10. Okay, so that's a baseline. That's the white color here. Now, if I look in 2050, for example, and I look at decadal record compared to the counterfactual, so I have to compare that to 1/10. And so in some sense here, which means like in some regions, this probability of 1/10 have been multiplied by 7. So I go from 1/10 to 7/10. So something which was kind of rare every 10 years, once every 10 years, becomes something 7 times every 10 years. So it could become very high. This doesn't mean it's true everywhere around the world. There is some region, as you know, that there is a decrease in precipitation intensity in some sense. And then you go from 1/10 that you divide, you multiply by 1/7. So that's a brown area here. And of course, between the green region and the brown region here, you have white, where we don't know exactly if it changed or not, basically. Okay, so one aspect of my introduction was to speak about detection and emergence time. So when do I know there's a change? Okay, so here, because as I say, it's like Dáithí Stone when it mentioned the monitoring. Here it's very easy to monitor because I know my baseline is 1/10. So this, if you look at my figure here, you go from 1850 to 2100. And then you can see the baseline here, because I look at decadal record, is 1/10. Okay, and I can look at the trajectory of my probability of recall, and I can see, for example, in 2000, clearly now I'm above the confidence interval of, so 1/10 is outside of the confidence interval I have. And so I can say the emergence time for this location, which was Richmond in the US, it's about 2000. So like this, for each year, I mean, for each location grid point, it's just one climate model, but you can see that I can detect that a lot of points are this color of like light orange or light green, which means like around 2000, and even some point it's even early, I could detect a change in record of maxima of early precipitation, the early maxima of daily precipitation. So this was the first part of my message, in some sense, that fact, if you start to think about record, it's easy in some sense because you have a very simple baseline. And then from that, you can do simple statistics and get, in a non-parametric way, in fact, a lot of information about the probability of change of records. One thing I didn't address yet, but I'm going to that, it's here I use only one model, which was the IPSL model. But of course, here, everyone in the rooms knows that we have a lot of models from Philippe 6, Philippe 5. And so the question is like, can we gain by combining this idea about record and climate models, ensembles? So here I'm going to use, again, the same idea. So basically, the notation doesn't change. X and Z are the factual and the counterfactual. But now I have a little subscript M, which means that's a model M. Okay? And so I'm suppose they are imperfect numerical climate runs, but I have them. And what can I do with that now? If I have not one run, but many different runs from different institutes. So here is basically my last slide with math, but I think it's an interesting one in some sense. It's always possible to write this equation. So this equation for you right now, I think, look very abstract, but it simply said that if you give me a run from a climate model, a time series from a climate model, xm, then if I knew its distribution, then I could apply that to the own variable. That would be a uniform distribution. And if I have the inverse of G, which is a distribution of the truth, counterfactual, then I get back the truth observation. Okay, that's in the counterfactual world, and I can do the same in the factual. In practice, this is never possible to do in some sense because we don't have access to the inverse of G, and we don't have we don't have F also. But what's possible to see is like for climate model, if we have this relationship A, condition A, it means that if I have to correct my model, if I do the same correction basically, which would be nonlinear, very complex, but still, if it is the same, to go from the model to the truth, then in the factual and the counterfactual, then I can do something. So under the condition A, which is written here, I have the following result. Basically, here I look not at 1/10 anymore, but at 1/2. I can get this kind of result. So in some sense, and I'm almost done with that, but what I'm saying, in some sense, if condition A is satisfied, then I can do relative computation perfectly. Okay, so I don't need model correction. So let's see how I can check that in practice. One way to check if this condition A is true is to say, and that's a big assumption on my part here, is to say from 1850 to 1900, the anthropogenic forcing was not too high, and so I suppose that the factual could be equal to the counterfactual. And then under this condition, I can check if A is true for a given climate model. So here I have 50 years where I can check from 1850 to 1900 if my condition is correct. And for example, if you look at QQ plot here, you can see there's 50 points for each climate model. And like for the CCM and the Météo France model here, it looks like for this grid point, it's not correct. So I can remove them from the analysis. But after that, I can do for each point the analysis I showed you before. And then I have to mix all this figure together in one. And again, I'm going to use the same idea because what I can do a convex combination, and I can give a price when I don't satisfy the baseline. And in this case, in this example, I just look at biannual period. So I just look at 2 years. So it's the quantity of interest is 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. And so if I do that, when I get, and that's going to be my last slide, I get the following curve. So if I look at biannual record, is the probability is 0.5. So you can see from 1850 to 1900, if I take the red curve, which is the base model in some sense, I start around 0.5, and after I increase a little bit. If I take the convex combination of all models together, so now they are very clearly centered on 0.5 by construction. But then after that, you can see the signal is much stronger, and the confidence interval is smaller. And also in terms of emergence time, for this grid point in Oxford, before I will have said, oh, the detection time is when my red confidence interval go outside of 0.5, which will be like 2040. Now my emergent time for this grid point is around 2000. So I got 40 years of increased climate detection signal with this kind of approach. And what I'm going, I can stop here in some sense, just to say that here I try to tell you that instead to look at the absolute value of things, if you look at relative quantity, you can go pretty far in terms of detecting things, and also you can deal with records. And my last point is to say that to detect a record, I don't need to observe the record. I can even extrapolate now this technique record which has never been observed. Okay, so I'm going to stop here, and I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Philippe. Thanks for this talk about the methodology, about how to choose the reference line. So it's a very interesting talk. I would like to say whether you are considering in this talk you use the factual and the counterfactual experiment. So I think the emergence of time, the emerging time is not only depends on the method, but also depends on model performance. How do you think about the model reliability?
Well, in some sense, everything I've done in this talk was in the climate model world. I didn't use any observations. And one reason I did that is because precipitation at the global scale back in time, like in 1900, they are not available, or they're very bad quality. So, and the precipitation, generated precipitation from climate model are strongly biased sometimes. Okay, so so the point here is that's why to me I don't look at the absolute value of precipitation. Here I look at relative trend of precipitation, and I believe that's correspond to the reality of precipitation. But also in the future, what we like to do in terms of modeling, incorporating precipitation measurements in this analysis, it will be to update the weight that combine all the models together. So instead of saying that observed precipitation and climate model precipitation are similar, we prefer to say that the climate model precipitation are fairly decent in terms of relative change, according to themselves. But to combine them, we need to give a higher price to a model that is close to the observation and a lower price if the model is far away from the observation.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Thank you very much. So because we are running out of time and we are running behind the time, so we have to say thank you. And in the end, I would like to thank all participants, and especially the 6 speakers in this session for your valuable contribution to this and active participation in this session. And if you have any questions, you could reach out the speakers. And in the end, thanks to all speakers and our audience. And in the end, I would to say, please join the session 2 of the climate themes day of year 2023. The topic of session 2 is climate change and its impact on terrestrial carbon cycle. This session starts at 1:30 p.m. UK time. And thanks all. Goodbye.